She ran with blood on her boots and the pale ghost of a crescent moon fading behind the ridge. And when Wesley Easton stepped out onto his porch that first morning to check on the frost, he nearly grabbed his rifle before he saw her collapse against his fence post like a tree felled by the wind. The frontier had a way of delivering trouble before a man had finished his first cup of bark tea, and Wesley Easton had learned long ago not to borrow panic before it arrived on his doorstep. But this was something different. He stood on the steps of his log cabin in the gray pre-dawn, his boots unlaced, his breath clouding in the cold air of early autumn, and watched the figure at his fence with the careful stillness of a man who had spent enough years on the edge of the graywood to know that rash movements cost lives. The figure was unmistakably an orc. Tall, broad-shouldered, powerfully built, even slumped as she was against the rough-hewn fence post. He could see the gray-green of her skin in the dimming moonlight, the dark hair that had come loose from a thick braid and was matted now against her cheek. She was not wearing clan war paint, not carrying weapons that he could see, and she had not come at him howling. She had simply fallen. He stayed on the porch for a full minute, maybe two. Then he went inside, sliced 2 thick pieces from the loaf of dark rye bread sitting on his cutting board, wrapped them in a cloth, walked out to the fence, set them on the top rail about a foot from where she had slumped, and went back inside without a word. He did not want to startle her. He did not want to crowd her. He figured if she was hungry, she would find it. If she was dangerous, she would not bother with bread. He watched from the window as the sky shifted from gray to pale gold, and sometime in the early light, she stirred, looked at the cloth, and took the bread. That was how it started. Her name was Bula Strongtusk, though he would not learn that until 3 days later, and the story of how she came to be bleeding and breathless at his fence post was a long one, tangled with clan law and grief, and a kind of trapped fury that had finally cracked open like ice giving way in spring. She was 26 years old, strong as a storm, and she had run from the Iron Joe clan at the very break of dawn with nothing but the clothes on her back and the knife at her hip that she had not needed to use. Not yet. The Iron Joe clan had made their war camp in the high foothills to the north and east, 7 miles as the crow flies from Wesley Easton's homestead, which sat at the edge of the cultivated land, where the valley opened up between the Graywood and the Tharrow River. It was border country, the kind of land that did not fully belong to anyone, not the frontier settlements pushing out from the east, not the orc territories that had once stretched across the whole of the northern range. It was contested ground that had been quiet for 3 years, and Wesley had settled there precisely because quiet land was cheap, and he had more stubbornness than money. Bula had not intended to arrive at his fence. She had intended to reach the river crossing at Tharrow Ford, where she had heard there was sometimes a bargeman who would take a coin and ask no questions. But she had misjudged the terrain in the dark, had twisted her ankle on a loose stone coming down the hillside, and when she found the fence line of the homestead, she had told herself she would rest only a moment. Her body had other ideas. She was wearing dark travel leathers when she came, close-fitted trousers tucked into knee-high boots, a laced leather bodice cinched over a deep green wool blouse that followed the strong lines of her figure, nipped at the waist and fitted through the shoulders, practical and feminine both at once, built for movement. A short oilskin traveling cloak was fastened at one shoulder with a bone clasp. Her thick dark hair, when it was not matted against her cheek from running, fell in a heavy braid down her back, threaded with a few small copper rings the way orc women of rank sometimes did. She was striking, not pretty in any way the small towns of the eastern settlements would have recognized or welcomed, but compelling in the way that wild things are compelling. High broad cheekbones, deep-set amber eyes under dark brows, a jaw that was strong and square, and the 2 lower canines that gave her people their name rising just past her lower lip, ivory pale and smooth. She was, had anyone stopped fearing her long enough to really look, beautiful. But fear came first always on the frontier. Wesley Easton was 28 years old, rangy and weather-worn in the way of men who do all their own work, with brown hair gone a little shaggy at the collar and hands that were calloused from the axe and the plow both. He had a homestead of 60 acres, most of it still wild. About 20 cleared a cabin he had built himself over 2 seasons, a horse named Duff, 4 chickens, and a strip of kitchen garden that did well enough to keep him fed through winter if he was careful. He was not a wealthy man. He was not a particularly social man. His nearest neighbor was Cora Birch, a widow who ran a small cattle operation about 4 miles south, and the nearest town of any consequence was Kettlemore, 11 miles east along the Wagon Road, a rough-edged border settlement with a trading post, a saloon, a farrier, and a population of about 200 souls who did not, as a rule, welcome or kind within their fence lines. He was a quiet man, but he was not a cold one. He had been raised by a father who believed that hunger was the one honest thing in the world. It did not lie about itself, and that feeding a hungry creature was the one honest response to it. So when he set the bread on the fence rail, he was not being heroic or reckless. He was simply being his father's son. By the second morning, she was still there, not at the fence post but further back in the scrubby brush beyond his field line, where the land dipped into a shallow hollow before rising again toward the tree line. He could see where she had been sleeping, a flattened patch in the tall, dry grass. He left more bread, and this time a wedge of hard cheese, and this time he noticed that her ankle, when she had shifted to watch him from the tree line, he only caught the movement from the corner of his eye, was still swollen enough to see from 20 feet away. He went in and put a pot of water on the fire. He came back out with a small clay jar of the Yarrowin pine tar salve that he used on Duff when the horse got a wire cut, a clean strip of linen, and a second bowl of warm oat porridge. He set these things on the fence post, next to the bread and the cheese, and then he looked out toward the hollow where he knew she was watching, and he said clearly to the empty air, "I am a person who minds his own business. You do not have to speak to me. But that salve will close up a bad ankle in 2 days if you use it right. You rub it in before you sleep and wrap it loose." He went back inside. He listened to his own heartbeat for a while. Then he heard the soft crunch of footsteps on the frost, closer than he expected. The porridge bowl was taken. The salve went too. On the third day, she was sitting on the top rail of his fence in the afternoon light when he came out of the barn after mucking the stall. He stopped walking. He said nothing. She looked at him with those amber eyes across about 30 feet of yard, and she said, in flat, precise frontier common tongue that told him she had learned it somewhere and learned it well, "You have not told anyone I am here." "No," he said. "Why not?" He scratched the back of his neck. "Because it is not their business." She studied him for a long time. He let her study. "My name is Bula Strongtusk," she said finally. "I left my clan 3 nights ago. I am not a raider. I am not a scout. I am not going to burn your barn or take your horse." "I know," he said. He meant it. Something shifted in her expression, not quite trust, not yet, but something that recognized the absence of malice and found it remarkable. "The salve worked," she said. "My ankle is almost sound." "Good," he said. "Are you hungry? I have stew on." She was quiet for a very long moment. Then she got down from the fence rail, and she followed him inside. Her name was not just a name. It was a weight she carried, because Strongtusk was a clan lineage, and in the Ironjaw clan, lineage meant obligation. Her mother had been a war caller, her father a ranking warrior, and when both of them had died in the border skirmish, 3 summers passed, the same one that had left burned homesteads on the eastern side of the valley. Bula had come under the authority of her mother's brother, a clan elder named Gruthak, who was political in the way that dangerous men who want more power than they have are political. He had arranged a bonding contract for her, not with anyone she would have chosen, not with anyone who wanted her the way a man ought to want a woman, but with a senior warrior from the Stoneclaw clan to the northwest, a strategic marriage meant to cement an alliance that Gruthak needed. The warrior's name was Drak, and he was not cruel precisely, but he was 43 years old and she was 26, and he had looked at her across the fire at the arrangement, meeting the way a man looks at a useful piece of equipment, and she had felt the walls of the rest of her life closing in like the sides of a canyon. She had not decided to run. She had simply woken at dawn 3 days ago, looked at the sky, and started moving. She told Wesley some of this, not all of it, sitting at his rough-hewn table over bowls of venison stew, while the fire crackled and Duff stamped occasionally in the barn outside. She told it plainly, without asking for sympathy, the way people who have been strong for a long time sometimes talk about pain, as if it is geography, as if they are describing the landscape of a place rather than the interior of themselves. He listened without interrupting, which she had not expected. The men in the eastern settlements who sometimes came to trade at the clan camps always talked over orc women, or grew restless when they spoke, or let their eyes wander to the door. Wesley sat with his elbows on the table and his bowl in his hands and listened as if what she was saying was the most reasonable thing he had heard all week. "What do you want to do?" he asked when she had finished. She looked at him. "What? Not what do you need to survive, not what do you have to do next. What do you want to do, if you could do anything?" No one had asked her that in so long she had to think about it honestly, like reaching for something in a dark room and finding the shape of it by feel. "I want to go south," she said at last, "to the Tharo Valley settlement. I have heard they take orc kind as workers during harvest. I could earn wages. I could be no one's arranged wife and no one's clan obligation." "Kettlemore is on the way to the Tharo Valley Road," Wesley said. "I am riding in next week for supplies. You could ride with me if you wanted to, or wait until your ankle is fully sound and I can see you as far as the Valley Road junction." She looked at him for a long time with those amber eyes. "You would do that?" "It is on my way," he said simply. She slept in his barn that first night, in the clean straw beside Duff's stall, and in the morning when Wesley came to feed the horse, he found that she had already mucked out the stall with clean efficiency, a thing that took him a quarter of an hour, and that she had apparently done in 10 minutes. He stood at the barn door and looked at the clean stall, and then at Bula, who was standing against the far wall with her arms folded, watching him with the guarded expression of someone waiting to be told they had overstepped. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once and something in her shoulders came down a fraction. Days passed. There was no dramatic turning point, no sudden moment of transformation. Instead, there was the slow, honest accumulation of small things. She helped him repair the section of fence on the south field that had been giving him trouble all season, working the heavy posts into the frozen ground with a strength that he could not have managed alone, saying nothing beyond the practical things: "Pass me the mallet. Hold that side. This post is not straight." He worked beside her and matched her silence with silence, and by the time they had finished and stepped back to look at a fence line that was finally sound, there was between them the quiet satisfaction of people who have done a real thing together. He noticed that she was careful with his things. His tools were always returned to where she had found them, his firewood split with a precision that left nothing wasted. She ate only what was offered and offered work in return for everything. When she caught a rabbit in a snare she set in the hollow beyond the field, she brought it to him rather than keeping it, skinned and cleaned, as though paying a debt she had invented herself. He took it and cooked it and they ate it together, and that was the first time she laughed, not much, not loudly, just a short huff of amusement when he dropped the wooden spoon into the pot and had to fish it out with 2 fingers, cursing the heat. "You are not a natural cook," she said. "I am surviving," he said. "There is a difference." "Barely," she said, and that was the first real smile, cautious and quickly hidden, but there. He was not unaware of her. He would have been made of stone not to be. She was striking in motion, in the way she carried herself with a deliberate, grounded ease that suggested absolute confidence in her own body, as if she had never once in her life been uncertain about where she was standing or whether she had the right to stand there. When she worked, the fitted bodice and close leather of her travel clothes moved with her, and Wesley found himself profoundly interested in repairing fences and splitting firewood and any other task that could be done side by side. He was not a man who pushed where he was not wanted, but he was also not blind. And Bula Strongtusk was not a woman a sane man was going to fail to notice. He kept his distance. He kept his silence. He minded the line. A week passed. Then the matter of Kettlemore came, and it arrived badly. He had told her he was riding in for supplies on the 9th day after she had arrived, and she had decided she would go with him. Her ankle was sound, she had rested, and she needed to know what the road south looked like, what the cost of passage might be if there was a barge or a coach connection from Kettlemore to the Valley Junction. She rode behind him on duff, which was not ideal but was what there was, her hands resting lightly on his sides rather than his waist, careful even in that small thing not to presume. Kettlemore in the morning was the sort of place that wanted to look welcoming, but had not quite gotten the hang of it. The main street was hard-packed dirt between rows of log and plank buildings, a sawdust-floored saloon on the corner, the trading post across from it, a farrier at the far end, and a scattering of people going about their morning business, women with market baskets, men at the hitching posts, a cluster of older men on the steps of the trading post who had apparently been sitting there since the settlement was founded. They noticed Bula the way a pond notices a stone dropped in it, a ripple that started at the center and moved outward. Wesley tied Duff at the post in front of the trading post and got down, and Bula swung down after him, and the cluster of men on the steps went quiet in a way that was louder than noise. He walked toward the trading post door, and she walked beside him, and the man who stepped into the doorway to block it was Owen Farrell, who ran the trading post with his brother and believed himself to be approximately in charge of frontier order. He was barrel-chested and ruddy, and he looked at Bula with an expression that was not hiding anything. "Can't have it in here," he said. Wesley stopped. He looked at Owen Farrell. He kept his voice completely even. "She is with me, Owen. I don't care who she's with. I have women and children shopping in there, and I will not have he cast about for a word, one of those in my store." Bula's expression had gone very still, the way a body of water goes still just before a storm puts a wind across it. She was not frightened. She was not surprised. She was just bearing it, the way a person bears a thing they have borne so many times it has worn a groove in them. Wesley stepped up onto the bottom step, putting himself level with Owen Farrell, and he said, quietly enough that the whole street went still to hear, "Her name is Bula Strongtusk. She is a free woman traveling the road legally on land that belongs to no settlement charter. She has done nothing, harmed no one, and she is standing in your street in broad daylight, which she has every right to do. You do not have to let her in your store, but you will not speak about her as if she is not a person standing 3 feet from you." Owen Farrell looked at him with genuine surprise, which was, Wesley thought, the most honest expression the man had probably shown in years. "You are making a mistake, Easton," he said. "That is my business," Wesley said. He turned to Bula. "Come on. There is a trader down at the East End who keeps a good supply of dry goods and does not require permission from Owen Farrell to sell them." He stepped off the step. He walked past the cluster of men, who parted and stared. He did not look back to see if Bula was following, but he heard her boot heels on the hard dirt a half step behind him, steady and unhurried, and he felt more strongly than he had expected how much it mattered to him that she not have to walk behind anyone. The East End trader was an older Telvarish man named Mars who had been trading on the frontier long enough to have sold to Orc clans and settlement farmers on alternate days, and found them equally capable of shortchanging him. He looked at Bula, looked at Wesley, and said, "What do you need?" in a tone that treated this as the beginning of a commercial transaction, which it was, and nothing more. Wesley bought his flour, salt, dried beans, and lamp oil. Bula, who had 2 small silver coins she had kept sewn into the lining of her traveling cloak since before she ran, bought a good quality waterproof tarp and a whetstone. Out on the street afterward, walking back toward where Duff was tied, she said without looking at him, "You did not have to do that." "I know," he said. "You made an enemy of Farrell. Farrell was already a fool. Making an enemy of a fool is the same as not having an enemy. She looked at him then, a quick sideways glance that contained something she did not immediately say. They reached Duff. She mounted up behind him. And this time, almost without thinking, her arms came around his waist rather than resting at his sides, and neither of them said anything about it. But he was aware of the warmth of her against his back all the 11 miles home, and he thought about very little else. There were 3 days left before she had planned to leave for the Valley Road. He found himself hating those 3 days for their shortness in a way he had not expected and did not quite know what to do with. He was not a man who had ever been short of work. The homestead was always half wild, always needing something, always just on the far edge of what he could manage alone. But those 3 days he was sharply, almost painfully aware of having company. Of the way the cabin felt different with 2 people in it. Of how the work went easier and went faster, and how the evenings, which had always been quiet in the way of a thing that does not know anything else, were now quiet in the way of a thing that is content. She slept in the barn still, on the principle of her own clear-eyed propriety, but they sat up late by the fire most evenings, talking. He told her about his family, his father, who had been a homesteader before him, dead of a fever when Wesley was 19. His mother, who had gone back east to her sister's family in the 3rd year of frontier settlement when the winters had broken her health. A younger brother, Aldrich, who was apprenticed to a farrier in a large eastern city and wrote letters home twice a year. She told him about her mother, who had been a great singer of the old Orc War ballads and had taught them to Bula until Bula knew every one. About her father, who had been quieter than was usual in the Iron Joe clan, and had carved small figures out of pine for her when she was a child, animals mostly. About the way the clan camp looked at first light in summer, the hide tents golden in the dawn, the smell of cook fires and pine resin, and the cold bite of mountain air. "You miss it," he said one evening. She was quiet for a moment. "I miss what it was before the skirmish, before my parents died and Gruthak took charge of things. The clan I ran from is not the clan I grew up in." She looked at the fire. "You lose 2 people and sometimes you lose a whole world with them." He nodded. He knew that in his bones. "You do," he said simply, and because it was simple truth and not performance, she looked at him and something in her expression opened a little, like a door that had been stuck on a swollen frame finally giving way. On the second to last day before her planned departure, she was sitting on the top fence rail in the late afternoon light, sharpening her knife on the new whetstone, and he was splitting wood nearby, and she said, without particular preamble, "Tell me why you are alone out here. You are 28. You are not unpleasant looking. You do not seem to frighten people the way I do. Why is there no woman on this homestead?" He laughed, which surprised him because it was a startlingly direct question and he was not used to people who said directly what they meant. "I was engaged once," he said, "to a girl from Kettlemore, Hannah Birchwood. She had her heart very much set on a proper house in a proper town, which is a reasonable thing to want. And I had my heart very much set on this homestead, which is this." He gestured broadly at the 60 acres of half-wild frontier. "We discovered that pretty early, and we parted without much damage done. That was 4 years ago." Bula ran the stone along the blade with a practiced stroke. "And since then, I have been mostly busy with the fence line and the crops and the argument I have been having with the South Field about whether it wants to be farmland or wants to stay wild. Who is winning? It is currently a draw," he said, "with the field having a slight advantage." She smiled, slow and genuine this time, not hiding it. It changed her whole face, the high cheekbones lifting, the amber eyes brightening, the small ivory tusks showing at the corners in a way he had already come to find completely, hopelessly charming. He put the axe down. He said, looking at the fence line rather than at her, because looking at her directly when he felt this way seemed like too much information to offer all at once, "I think this is good land, Beulah. If a person chose to stay, if they wanted to build something on it, there would be room. I'm not saying you owe me anything or that you should change your plans on my account. But I think it is worth saying plainly so you know it is true. I would not be sorry if you stayed." The sound of the whetstone on the blade stopped. He made himself look at her. She was looking at him with an expression he could not fully read, which was unusual because he had gotten pretty good at reading her in 10 days. It was layered and complicated and somewhat raw, and after a long moment she said, "I have been someone's obligation my entire life. I have never been someone's choice." "I know," he said. "I am telling you that you are mine, if you want to be." The silence stretched long enough that a crow called twice in the distance and the wind moved through the dry grass in the south field. Then Bula said, "I am going to think about it." "That is all I asked," he said. He picked up the axe. He split 3 more pieces of wood. His heart was hammering in his chest so loudly he was mildly concerned she could hear it, because he was fairly sure her hearing was better than his. She thought about it through the night and the next morning, and at midday on what had been her last day, when he was coming in from the barn and she was standing at the well drawing water, she said without ceremony, "I will stay through winter. I will work for my keep. I will not be a charity case. And in the spring we will see." "In the spring we will see," he agreed, and if he did not manage to keep every bit of his relief off his face, he thought she did not mind too much, because she was not hiding the small, private thing in her own expression either. Staying through winter on the Easton homestead was not a quiet or simple arrangement. There were immediate practical problems to address, the first of which was that Bula could not sleep in the barn through a graywood winter, which arrived fast and hard and routinely killed livestock, let alone people. Wesley solved this by spending 3 days building out the small storeroom at the back of the cabin into a proper sleeping space, adding a cot frame, cutting a new small window for air, and putting in a second brazier from the old iron pieces he had in the barn. She helped with the build, which went twice as fast with her there, and when it was done it was a decent small room. Not large, not grand, but warm and private and hers. The town got wind of the arrangement by the 2nd week of October. Not from Wesley, who had told no one anything, but because Cora Birch had ridden past the homestead on her way to Kettlemore and had seen Bula in the field and had mentioned it to someone in town, and information in a settlement of 200 people traveled the way fire travels in dry grass. 2 men from Kettlemore arrived on a cold morning in mid-October on horseback, crossing the south field without permission. Wesley heard them coming and came out to the porch, and Bula came out of the barn where she had been cutting harness leather for a repair, and they stood side by side as the 2 men pulled up at the yard gate. One of them was Wren Calloway, who was something of Kettlemore's unofficial deputy, self-appointed, no proper law badge, but big enough and loud enough to have made the role stick. The other was a man named Dawes, who did not say much but was carrying a long rifle across his saddle in the careless way of a man who wants it to be noticed. "Easton," Calloway said, pulling his horse up short. His eyes went to Bula and stayed there with a pointed unpleasantness. "We have gotten word you are harboring an orc on your land." "She is a guest on my land," Wesley said. "Which is my land? Which is the relevant part of that sentence?" "There are people in town who are concerned," Calloway said. "We have families here. You have a great deal of concern for people who have done nothing to you," Wesley said. He stepped down from the porch into the yard, putting himself between Calloway's horse and the place where Bula was standing. "Bula Strongtusk is a free woman. She is not a member of a raiding party. She is not a combatant. She is not a threat to anyone in Kettlemore. If you have a specific grievance, a crime, a trespass, a harm done, state it. If you do not, you are on my property without invitation." Calloway's jaw worked. The man Dawes shifted his grip on his rifle slightly, and Wesley watched the movement with the peripheral clarity of a man who had grown up hunting and knew exactly what that shift meant and what it did not mean. Bula had moved without drama, a step to Wesley's right. She had set the harness leather down. Her own hand was not on the knife at her hip, but her posture had changed, not aggressive, but present in a way that was absolutely unmistakable. She was not hiding behind him. She was standing beside him, which was an entirely different thing, and Calloway could see it and did not quite know what to do with it. "You are making trouble for yourself, Easton," Calloway said. "That is a habit of mine," Wesley said. "Good morning to you both." The two men looked at each other. Then Calloway turned his horse and they rode back out across the south field the way they had come, and Wesley and Bula stood in the yard and watched them until they were out of sight, and then Wesley let out a long breath. "That will not be the end of it," Bula said. "No," he agreed, "but it will not be the end of us either." He turned to look at her when he said that, and found that she was already looking at him, close enough now that he could see the individual copper rings in her braid, and the small, fine scar on her left cheekbone from something long ago. She held his gaze for a beat longer than was necessary, which, in the careful economy of what they were to each other, was equivalent to a great deal. "No," she said quietly, "it will not." November came down hard and cold, with early snow that blanketed the south field and silvered the fence posts and made the world very still and very white. There were good days in the snow, a kind of enforced closeness to the cabin that Wesley did not mind at all. They fell into a rhythm of the sort that takes months to develop, and then seems as though it has always existed. She was up first most mornings, had the fire built up by the time he came out, and had usually begun something practical leather work, or sharpening tools, or looking at the seeds he had laid aside for spring planting with a critical and clearly expert eye. He made breakfast. She told him what she thought was wrong with his seed selection. He argued back on the basis of 3 seasons of experience with the specific idiosyncrasies of the South Field. She maintained her position with the patient firmness of someone who has learned agriculture in Orc territory, where the margins are even thinner. They were usually both partially right, which became a reliable and comfortable thing between them. She began teaching him words in the Orc language, the old rolling tongue that her mother had sung in, because one night he asked what a phrase he had heard Orc traders use at the border market actually meant, and she told him, and then she told him 3 more words, and then they were an hour and a half into a language lesson with the fire burning low and neither of them had noticed the time going. He was not a natural linguist, and she laughed at his pronunciation with increasing freedom, a real laugh now, full-throated and warm, which he had decided some time in the last few weeks was his absolutely favorite sound in the world. He taught her the frontier names for the winter stars, which were different from the clan names she had grown up with. They stood outside one clear November night with the snow crisp underfoot and their breath making clouds in the frozen air, and he pointed out the configurations, the plowman, the fox, the crown, while she told him the Orc names for the same stars, the wolf dancer and the burning tooth and the long sleep. They were standing very close because the cold demanded it, shoulders almost touching, looking up at the same sky, and Wesley thought that he had never in his life felt so precisely in the right place. "Which is your favorite?" he asked. "The long sleep," she said, her voice soft in the cold air. "My mother said that the long sleep is the star of returning, that you navigate by it when you are lost and trying to come home." He looked at the star she pointed to, a bright, steady one near the horizon, low in the northern sky. "Do you want to go home?" he asked, not as a pointed question, not as a challenge, just as a thing he wanted to know. She was quiet for a moment. "I want to," she said carefully. "I think there is a difference." He nodded. The snow glittered around them. He felt her shoulder press slightly against his, warmth through 2 layers of wool and hide, and he did not move away, and neither did she, and they stood like that under the stars for a long time until the cold finally drove them back inside. There was an evening in early December that he would remember for the rest of his life. The wind had come up hard from the north, a proper graywood blizzard building along the ridge, and they had spent the day battening everything down, shuttering the barn windows, banking extra firewood against the cabin wall, checking the cabin's roof boards for any gaps. By the time they came inside, they were both windswept and cold, and the fire inside was a shock of warmth that felt like being held. She sat down in front of the hearth to work off her boots, which were soaked through with snowmelt, and he went to put a pot on for hot broth, and he turned around from the fire with 2 cups and found her sitting there with her hair loose from its braid, which he had never seen before. It fell around her shoulders in thick dark waves, the copper rings catching the firelight, and she had her hands around her knees, and she was looking at the fire with an expression that was private and unguarded in a way she did not usually allow herself to be when he could see her. And he stood with the 2 cups in his hands and felt the full force of something that had been building for 2 months hit him all at once, like stepping into a river and discovering the current is stronger than you thought. She looked up and saw him standing there. He crossed the room and gave her a cup and sat down beside her on the hearthrug, close enough that their arms were touching and neither of them moved away. The storm battered the shutters, the fire crackled, the cabin was warm and sealed against the world. "I have been thinking," she said, looking at the fire. "Yes," he kept his voice steady, "about the spring, about what comes after." And she turned to look at him, which meant turning toward him completely, close as they were. And for a moment they were simply looking at each other in the firelight at a distance of about 8 inches, and he was aware of every detail, the amber of her eyes gone dark gold in the firelight, the fine structure of her face, the set of her jaw, the small ivory tusks that he had long since stopped noticing as anything other than part of her, the same way he did not notice the color of his own eyes. She was wearing her expression of careful deliberation, the one she wore when she was about to say something that mattered. "I do not want to go south," she said. "I have been telling myself that I do because it was the plan, and I do not like to change a plan once I have made it, but the truth is that I want to stay here." She held his gaze. "With you. Not as a not out of practicality or because I have nowhere else to go. I have places I could go. I want to stay here specifically, with you specifically." His heart had entirely forgotten how to behave in a normal fashion. He said, "I am very glad to hear that," which was possibly the most significant understatement of his life to date. She was still looking at him with those gold-dark eyes. And then, slowly, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, which he had learned in the past weeks was an orc gesture of profound trust, of offering and also receiving a thing done between people who meant something to each other. He sat very still and let himself feel the warmth of it, her forehead against his, and he lifted one hand and rested it against her jaw, gentle as careful as he knew how to be, just his palm against the side of her face, and she turned her face slightly into his hand the way a person turns toward warmth. "Bula," he said. "Yes," she said, which was not an answer to her name but an answer to the question he had not finished asking, and he kissed her. It was gentle and unhurried, the way things felt between them when they were at their truest. No drama, no performance, just the honest reality of it, her lips against his, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, and the fire behind them and the storm outside and the whole winter-sealed world held at bay. When they drew back, it was not very far, and they stayed close in the firelight for a long time afterward without needing to say much, which was a kind of peace he had not known was possible. December brought more snow and the inevitable complications of 2 people who are falling in love and have not yet worked out the full terms of it. There was a stretch of a week where they were both slightly awkward in each other's presence, overly careful, occasionally saying the wrong thing and knowing it and having to back up and try again. He said something careless about the clan once, not cruel, just thoughtless, a generalization about orc raiding patterns that he had picked up from the Kettlemore men's conversation, repeated without thinking, and she went quiet and very still in a way that was worse than anger, and he sat with the silence for a minute and then said, "That was a stupid thing to say. I know better." "I am sorry," and she looked at him for a long moment and said, "Yes," and then after another moment, "Thank you for saying so." And they moved on, which was how they handled the difficult things, not perfectly, but honestly, which was better. He wrote a letter to his brother Aldrich in the city. He did not explain everything, because some things resisted letter format, but he said that he had met someone, that she was remarkable, that he was very much hoping she intended to stay. Aldrich wrote back in 6 weeks to say that he was glad, and that their father would have liked the sound of her based on what little Wesley had written, and that he hoped to come out in the spring and meet her. Wesley set the letter on the kitchen table where Bula could see it, and she read it, and she said nothing, but she folded it very carefully and set it back in its place with a precision that suggested she had been moved by it and was not quite ready to say so. The new year arrived cold and quiet. January was the hardest month on the homestead, the south field entirely buried, the wood supply requiring constant attention, Duff needing extra care in the frozen barn. They worked through it together, and the working together had by now lost all its earlier self-consciousness and settled into a deep, organic partnership. They anticipated each other. She knew to bring him the spare latch pins when he was working on the barn door without his having to ask. He knew to heat extra water without being told when she came in from the cold with that particular tension in her jaw that meant her old ankle injury was aching in the frost. They did not discuss this. It was simply how things were. They were sleeping in the cabin together by January, not in the separate room, but in the main room with its bigger hearth, because the second brazier had given out a crack in the iron, and the storage room was too cold. He had put the cot out for her by the fire and kept to the bed on the far side, and that had lasted approximately 4 nights before they were both awake at 2 in the morning listening to the wind, and she had said, with zero ceremony, "This is ridiculous. It is warmer in the bed." And he had said, with equally zero ceremony, "Yes." And she had brought her blankets over, and that was that. They slept pressed together for warmth, her back against his chest or her face against his shoulder, and it was the most natural thing either of them had done in years, and by February neither of them had any pretense that they did not entirely love each other in the most complete and unambiguous sense of the word. February also brought trouble back, as troubles tend to come back when they have not been fully resolved. A man arrived at the homestead alone, on foot, which was unusual enough on a winter road that Wesley saw him coming from a long way off. He came over the ridge to the north, which was not the wagon road from Kettlemore but the foothill track that came down from the Orc territory. He was Orc kin, old, heavyset, wearing the clan color of the Iron Joe in the trim of his coat, and when he came into the yard and looked at the cabin and then at Bula, who had come out of the barn and gone very still, Wesley knew that whatever this was, it had been coming for a while. The man was not Gruthak. That was Wesley's first thought when he came out to stand beside Bula. He was older than he had imagined Gruthak, his green-gray face deeply lined, his dark eyes steady and without particular aggression. He had a rolled paper in his hand, sealed with the Iron Joe clan mark in red wax. He spoke in the common tongue for Wesley's benefit, which was a courtesy that told Wesley something about him. "I am called Veth," he said. "I am the clan's message runner, not a warrior and not a threat. Bula Strongtusk. Gruthak sends a contract notice." He held out the paper. Bula did not take it. She looked at it for a long moment and then looked at Veth and said, "He cannot send a contract notice to a woman who is no longer of the clan. I left, under the free exit clause that has been in the Iron Joe laws since before Gruthak's time." "He contests the free exit," Veth said, not unkindly. "He says the contract with Drak was agreed before you left, and the agreement creates a binding." "I was not consulted in the agreement," Bula said. "I was informed. That is not the same thing under the old law." Her voice was absolutely level. "Tell Gruthak that I know the laws he learned alongside me, and they do not say what he wants them to say, and I am not coming back." Veth looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Wesley. Then he looked at the homestead, the solid cabin, the sound fence, the cleared field under the snow, the barn with its warm interior. He was taking something in, Wesley thought, some calculation or assessment. Then Veth put the rolled paper inside his coat. "I will tell him," he said. "I cannot promise what he will do next." "I know," Bula said. "I never could." Veth turned and walked back out of the yard and up the foothill track, and when he was out of sight, Beulah let out a long, shaky breath that she had clearly been holding throughout the entire exchange, and Wesley put his hand on her shoulder and felt the tension in it vibrate under his palm like a bow string. "He will send warriors," she said. "Not many, 2 or 3. It is how Gruthak works. He will not come himself because he cannot afford to be seen as petty, but he will send enough to make a point." "When?" Wesley asked. "Spring," she said. "He will wait for the pass to clear. 2 months, maybe 3. "Then we have 2 months," Wesley said, "and I intend to use them well." He was not planning to take Beulah anywhere, and he was not planning to hand her over to anyone. What he was planning, and what he did over the following weeks with a kind of quiet, determined purpose, was to make the situation legally and publicly clear. He rode to Kettlemore and, somewhat to the astonishment of Owen Farrell, who was watching from the trading post steps, went into the small office of the settlement's official land recorder, a meticulous Southron man named Dent who took frontier law very seriously, and filed a partnership declaration of homestead, adding Bula Strongtusk's name to the land claim as co-claimant. Frontier law allowed this. It was not widely done, especially not in cross-species arrangements, but it was legal, and Dent was a man who cared more about whether the paperwork was correct than about what the people around him thought of the arrangement. The second thing Wesley did was go to the Kettlemore saloon on a busy Saturday evening when most of the settlement's men were in, and he stood at the bar and he said, loud enough for the room, "Bula Strongtusk is my partner and co-claimant on the Easton homestead. I am telling you this straight so there is no confusion. She is not a threat to this settlement. She is not a raider or a scout. She is a free woman with her name on a legal land claim, and anyone who interferes with her does so as a trespasser on claimed frontier property." He paused. "I also serve better food than this saloon does, and if you want to come out and see for yourselves, you are welcome." He sat down with his drink. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then someone at the back laughed, not a mean laugh, but a genuine one, and the conversation resumed. And not everyone in that saloon was won over that night, but several of them were, and the ones who were not at least had the full picture of what was true. Beulah heard about it from Cora Birch, who had apparently been in the saloon that evening for reasons of her own, and had ridden out to the homestead the next morning with a kind of delighted energy that suggested she had been waiting for something entertaining to happen in Kettlemore for some time. She told Beulah the whole of it with relish, and by the time she was done, Beulah had the expression on her face of someone who does not know whether to laugh or cry and is managing to do neither. And when Cora had finally ridden back south to her cattle, Beulah found Wesley in the barn and stood in the barn doorway and said, "You declared me in front of the whole saloon." "I declared you at the land office first," he said, from where he was checking Duff's shoes. "I wanted the legal part to be solid before the social part." She crossed the barn in 3 strides and stopped in front of him and took his face in both her large hands and kissed him with a conviction and a warmth that made him drop the hoof pick entirely. And she laughed against his mouth, and he pulled her in with both arms, and they stood in the barn in the cold February air with Duff regarding them with equine patience. And it was, Wesley thought, entirely perfect. Aldrich Easton arrived in April on the first truly clear week after the snowmelt, riding out from Kettlemore in a hired wagon with his travel bag, and a ridiculous wide-brimmed hat that he had apparently acquired in the city, and that made him look nothing like his brother. He was 24, lean like Wesley but more talkative, with their father's chin and their mother's sense of humor, and he stood in the yard of the homestead and looked at Bula Strongtusk with the alert, open interest of a person who is genuinely curious about the world. "You are Beulah," he said. "Yes," she said, with the wariness she always held in first meetings. "Wesley's letters do not do you justice," he said, which was a remarkably forward thing to say to someone he had just met, but he said it with such genuine simple honesty that it landed well. He said you were remarkable. He did not say he meant it as an understatement. Beulah looked at Wesley. Wesley was looking at his boots with an expression that suggested he was reconsidering certain things he had written in the privacy of letters that he had not expected to be quoted aloud. "Come inside," Bula said to Aldrich, and there was warmth in it. "There is a meal." Aldrich stayed for 2 weeks, and he and Bula got along in the way that people sometimes do when they find each other straightforwardly interesting. No performance, no testing, just two people who discovered they liked the same kinds of honesty. He helped with the spring planting. He and Bula had long conversations about city life versus frontier life that Wesley sometimes joined and sometimes just listened to from wherever he was working, pleased in a way that was almost physical at the sound of it. Before he left, Aldrich drew Bula aside. Wesley watched from the distance with considerable curiosity, and whatever he said to her made her face do something complicated and quiet, and when she came back to where Wesley was, she did not tell him what was said, and he did not ask, because some things are between siblings and the people they love. Aldrich left on a Thursday. On Friday, Gruthak's men arrived. There were 3 of them, young warriors in clan colors, riding hard down the foothill track in the early morning. Wesley saw them from the porch and went inside to where Bula was at the table and said, "3 riders, Ironjaw." She was on her feet immediately, that deep physical readiness in her that he had come to know. She moved to the window and looked out. "Gruthak's nephew is the one in front," she said quietly. "His name is Rock. He is not thinking for himself. He is doing what he has been told." "What does that mean for how this goes?" "It means if we give him a way to go back to Gruthak with something that is not complete failure, he will probably take it." Wesley nodded. "Then let us give him one." They went out to the yard together, standing side by side at the fence gate as the 3 riders came down into the homestead approach. Rock was indeed young, 20 or so, broad-shouldered, carrying himself with the forced authority of a young man given a task and determined not to look frightened by it. He pulled his horse up at the fence line and looked at Bula with a mixture of official sternness and something that Wesley read as private discomfort. "Gruthak requires your return to the clan and your fulfillment of the contract with Drak," Rock said. He had a formal speech prepared. You could hear it in the cadence. "You have shamed the—" "I have shamed no one," Bula said. Her voice was level and extremely clear. "I exercise the free exit right under Ironjaw law. I'm a co-claimant on this homestead which is registered under frontier land law with the Kettlemore Settlement Office. I am a free woman. Drak is owed nothing by me because no agreement I was party to was ever made." She paused. "Tell Gruthak that I know the law. Tell him I am not afraid of him. And tell him, and I mean this, Rock, from one clan born to another, that the world is changing, and the clans that survive in it will be the ones that change with it, not the ones that keep trading their women for alliances like pieces on a strategy board." Rock sat his horse. His jaw was working slightly. The 2 warriors behind him were being carefully still. Then Wesley stepped forward to the fence gate and said, "I want to be fair to you, Rock. So I am going to tell you plainly what you would learn from inquiring. There are a dozen men in Kettlemore who know Bula Strongtusk by name and know she is on this homestead, and the land claim is registered and witnessed. And anything that happens to her or to this property is going to have documented witnesses and legal standing all the way to the settlement court at Easton. Gruthak's contract is not enforceable under frontier law. Coming here with warriors to compel a free woman on registered homestead land is actionable as trespass and coercion." He held Rock's gaze. "You seem like a sensible man. So does your uncle in the parts where sense serves him. This is not a fight that has a good ending for the Ironjaw." Rock looked at Wesley for a long time. Then he looked at Bula. Then he looked at the homestead, the solid, permanent reality of it, the cabin and the barn and the cleared fields and the strong fence line. Then he looked back at the 2 warriors behind him. He turned his horse. "We will return to Gruthak," he said, to no one in particular. They rode back up the foothill track without another word, and this time when they were out of sight, it was Wesley who let out the long breath, and Bula who put her hand on his arm, and they stood together in the spring morning and felt the tension drain out of the air like water out of a cracked vessel. "Do you think that is the end of it?" he asked. "I think Gruthak will calculate the cost," she said. "And I think he is calculating creature first and prideful creature second, which means he will decide it is not worth it. He has other alliances to pursue. I am only useful to him as long as I am retrievable." She looked up at the foothill track, now empty. "I am not retrievable." "No," Wesley said, with a feeling that was satisfaction and something much warmer. "You certainly are not." Spring on the Easton homestead was the most beautiful thing Wesley had seen in years, and he thought it was at least partly because he was seeing it with someone he loved beside him. The south field thawed and turned, and they planted together, a larger crop than he had managed alone, with Bula's expertise on the orc planting methods expanding what the field could do in ways he had not guessed. They put in an additional quarter-acre of kitchen garden. He built a proper chicken coop to replace the rough one that had served since his first year. She built with a competence that astonished him, even though by now very little she did should have surprised him. A proper smokehouse from stone and river clay, mortised and solid, something he had been meaning to do for 2 years and had not had the skills or the hands for. There was a day in late May when they were both in the south field, and the sun was warm and the air smelled of turned earth and new grass, and he looked up from the furrow he was walking and saw her at the far end of the field, tall and strong in her travel leathers with the laces of the bodice loose at the top in the warmth, her dark hair braided back with the copper rings catching the sun, and she was laughing at something. At Duff, he thought, who had gotten into the field corner again and was investigating the newly turned soil with an expression of philosophical inquiry, and the laugh rang across the field, warm and real, and Wesley Easton stood in the middle of his south field in the May sun and understood with absolute certainty that he wanted to spend the rest of his life on exactly this piece of ground with exactly this woman. He walked to the end of the field. She saw him coming, and the laugh settled into a smile, her eyes warm in the sun. He stopped in front of her, and she looked at him with that slight tilt of her head that meant she was reading him. "What?" she said. "Marry me," he said. She blinked. Not with surprise, exactly more with the expression of someone who has been expecting a particular thing but is still momentarily stopped by actually receiving it. "Is that what you want?" she said carefully. "Yes," he said. He reached out and took her hand in both of his, her hand large and strong, his calloused from the same work she did, and held it. "Not because of the land claim or the frontier law or Gruthak or anything else practical, because I love you, because you are the most remarkable person I have ever met, and I want you in my life for all of it." Bula looked at their hands joined together, and then up at his face, and the expression on her face was the most open and unguarded he had ever seen it, stripped of all its usual careful control, and she said, "Yes," without hesitation. He drew her in and kissed her there in the south field, with Duff watching them from 6 feet away and the whole spring day bright around them, and she put both arms around him and held him close, and the field and the sky and the strong good earth were witness to it. They married in June. It was not a settlement wedding. Kettlemore did not have a proper church, and even if it had, Wesley had not been going to ask a town that had needed convincing to accept a ceremony in their name. Instead, they did it the way Cora Birch suggested, with frontier sense. They went to the Kettlemore land office and signed the partnership into a full legal bond before Dent the recorder, with Cora and Aldrich, who had come back for the occasion, and the Telvarish trader Mars as witnesses. Then they came back to the homestead and had a celebration that evening with a fire in the yard and food enough for a proper gathering. And the people who came, about 14 of them, settlement folk who had been won over slowly over the long months, including 2 families from Kettlemore and Old Mars and Cora and her ranch hand, were not enough to fill a hall, but were enough to fill the yard with warmth and noise, and the kind of laughter that means something is genuinely right. Someone brought a fiddle. Bula danced orc dancing, which was not like settlement dancing but was its own thing entirely, grounded and rhythmic and alive. And she pulled Wesley in and taught him the steps with patient amusement while he made a creditable effort and managed not to embarrass himself entirely. And Aldrich cheered from the fence rail. And Cora was laughing so hard she had to sit down. And the fire was high, and the stars were out, and the night was warm. Late in the evening, when the guests had drifted home and Aldrich had gone to bed on his cot inside, Wesley and Beulah sat together at the edge of the fire, her head resting on his shoulder and his arm around her, and the yard was quiet and glowing with embers, and she said softly, "I left in the dark. I thought I was going to the valley. I thought I was going to be nobody's anything." "And," he said, "and I ended up here," she said, "being yours and having you be mine." She lifted her head and looked at him. "I think I was navigating by the long sleep and did not know it." He kissed her temple, then her cheek, then the corner of her mouth, slowly and with all the deliberateness of a man who knew he had all the time in the world. She turned toward him and the kiss deepened, warm and full of everything the year had been between them, the cold mornings and the hard work and the bread on the fence rail and the fire and the stars and all of it. And she said his name against his lips, just his name, and he felt it in his whole chest. They walked inside together, hand in hand, and closed the door behind them on the warm summer night, and the fire in the yard burned slowly down to coals, and the stars moved overhead in their slow wheeling paths, and the homestead was quiet and full and complete. Their wedding night was everything it should have been, tender and real and unhurried, built on a year's worth of knowing each other in the deep and careful way of people who had taken their time. There was nothing urgent or desperate about it. It was instead the gentle, inevitable arrival at a place they had been traveling toward since the first bread left on the fence rail in the October dawn. He loved her the way she had taught him, patiently and specifically, with attention to the details of what made her breath catch and what made her laugh, and she came to him with the same generous, wholehearted directness she brought to everything, and there was warmth and closeness, and the profound relief of two people who have been solitary for too long finally finding that they are not alone. They fell asleep late and close, the summer air soft through the cabin window, and if the world outside still held all its old difficulties and distances and prejudices, inside the Easton homestead there was nothing but peace. Summer turned and the harvest came in better than any Wesley had managed alone, substantially better, enough to fill the smokehouse and the root cellar and still have a surplus to sell at the Kettlemore market. They went to the market together in August, loading the wagon with sacks of grain and jars of preserved goods, and the market square was full of people, and there were still eyes that went to Beulah and then away, and then back again with the flat, uncertain look of prejudice negotiating with reality. But there was also Cora Birch, who greeted her like an old friend, and Mars, who bought their surplus grain on fair terms and called her by name, and two women from the Eastern Settlement Road who had heard about the Easton homestead and came specifically to speak with her about orc planting methods, because word had gotten around that the Easton South field had produced a remarkable crop. She talked with those women for 45 minutes, crouched over a patch of market square dirt, drawing the planting pattern with a stick while they listened with close attention, and Wesley sold their goods and watched from across the square with a feeling that was indistinguishable from pride. On the ride home, she said, "Those women want to learn the deep soil method for the clay fields on the East Road. Are you going to teach them? I told them to come to the homestead next planting season." She paused. "I hope that is agreeable." "Everything you do is agreeable," he said. She gave him the look she gave when she thought he was being excessively charming, which was its own kind of pleasure. September brought the harvest fully in, and October brought the first frost, and the second year on the homestead began to find its shape. Veth the message runner came again in early October, alone again, on foot, in the quiet way that meant he was there officially but without aggression, and he carried a paper that was not a contract notice this time but something different. He handed it to Beulah without preamble. She read it. Then she read it again. Then she looked at Veth with an expression Wesley could not immediately interpret. "Drock has bonded with someone else," she said. "A woman from the Eastern clan who wanted it." "Yes," Veth said. "And Gruthak," he paused, as though weighing the words, "has lost the vote for clan leadership to his cousin Marta, who has different views on the bonding laws." "The free exit clause is now affirmed." Bula was very still. "Is Marta good?" she asked. "She is fair," Veth said, "which in my experience is better than good." He glanced at the homestead, at the solid cabin and the barn and the smokehouse and the cleared fields. "The clan," he paused again. "There are some who would like to know that you are well." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Tell them I am more than well," she said. "Tell them I found what I was looking for." Veth nodded. He looked at Wesley once, directly and with appraisal, and seemed to find whatever he was looking for. Then he turned and went back up the foothill track, and Bula stood in the yard with the paper in her hand and did not move for a while, and Wesley came and stood beside her without speaking, and after a moment she leaned her head against his shoulder, which was something she did now without thinking, as naturally as breathing. "Does it change anything?" he asked. "No," she said. "Except," she paused, "except I do not have to be someone who ran away anymore. I can be someone who chose to leave." She lifted her head. "That is different. It feels different." "It is different," he said. "Both things are true, but the second one is the one that matters." She folded the paper carefully and put it in her coat pocket, and they went inside together. That winter was easier than the first. They had more supplies, a better banked cabin, a smokehouse full of preserved meat, and the settled ease of people who know each other's patterns and have stopped needing to explain themselves. Aldrich wrote a long letter at winter solstice that was mostly about his own news, but ended with a paragraph about how he had been talking to people in the city who were interested in frontier land opportunities, and specifically in the Easton homestead's yield figures, which apparently were unusual enough to attract attention. He suggested that Wesley write up his methods, including Bula's contribution specifically, which Aldrich had mentioned in his own tellings, and he offered to find a printer who might be interested. They wrote it together over the course of January, Wesley writing and Bula dictating and correcting, the two of them arguing cheerfully over phrasings and diagrams while the fire burned and the snow fell outside. The document they produced was 60 pages of handwritten agricultural notes on frontier soil management, orc and human methods integrated and annotated, with specific application to clay-heavy and rocky soils. It was exactly the kind of thing almost no one in the settlement world had ever thought to write, because almost no one in the settlement world had ever worked across that particular knowledge divide. Aldrich got it printed in the spring, a thin pamphlet that found its way to agricultural societies in 2 major eastern cities, and which generated correspondence that Bula handled at the kitchen table with a focused efficiency that Wesley found entirely characteristic of her. In late February, on a morning when the snow was still thick but the light had taken on that quality that said spring was thinking about arriving, Bula came and found him in the barn and stood in the doorway with her hand resting on the frame and said, "I am going to have a child." He had been cleaning harness. He set it down. He looked at her. She was watching him with a characteristic careful attention, measuring his response in the way she still did sometimes, the old habit of waiting to see whether something good would be taken away. He crossed the barn and put his arms around her and said against her hair, "That is the best news anyone has ever told me in a barn." She laughed, which was what he had wanted, and he held her and felt her arms come around him, and they stood in the warm barn in the smell of hay and horse while the snow continued outside, and he thought that his father would have found this extraordinary and wonderful and true, and he was absolutely right about it. The pregnancy was visible by spring and a matter of considerable public knowledge in Kettlemore by summer, and this was a different kind of test, not the sharp hostility of the early days, but the various gradations of discomfort and curiosity, and occasional outright disapproval from settlement folk who had not quite caught up with the new reality. There were looks and comments, and one ugly thing said in the market square in July, by a man who had too much to drink and too little sense, a thing aimed at both of them and specifically at the child. And Wesley turned around from the wagon where he had been loading supplies and said very quietly to the man, "You will not say that again," in a tone of voice that apparently conveyed enough of his feelings on the matter that the man chose not to. And Cora Birch, who happened to be nearby, turned to the small cluster of market-goers who had witnessed it and said loudly, "Easton Homestead produces the best grain in the valley, by the way, which some of you know and all of you should," which had the double effect of defending Bula's dignity and successfully redirecting the conversation, and which Wesley appreciated deeply. Their son was born in October, on a clear cold morning that smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves, delivered with the help of Cora Birch and a traveling midwife named Petra who had seen stranger things than a half-orc birth and took it entirely in stride. He was a solid, healthy boy with his mother's coloring and his father's nose and a look in his dark eyes that suggested he was already forming opinions. They named him Roan, a frontier name, neither wholly orc nor wholly human, something that could be his own. Bula held him in the firelight that first evening, with an expression on her face that Wesley had never seen on anyone before, and would not see again on anyone else. The complete and undefended love of a parent in the first hour, the dissolution of every careful wall she had ever built, not because the walls weren't needed anymore, but because something had arrived that made all walls temporarily irrelevant. He sat beside her and she leaned against him, and Roan looked up at them both with the unfocused, solemn gaze of the very newborn, and Wesley put one finger into Roan's small fist and felt the grip of it, strong even then, and thought, "This is what I was here for." He told Bula that later when Roan was sleeping and the cabin was warm and quiet, and she looked at him and said, "No, we were here for each other first. He is what came after." "You are right," he said. "You are almost always right." "I know," she said without smugness, just as fact. He kissed her and she kissed him back, and Roan slept and the fire burned low. The years that followed were not always easy. The frontier was not a place that went easy. There were hard winters and difficult harvests, and the ongoing, patient work of building something real in country that resisted being built on. There was the slow, imperfect, sometimes frustrating work of integration, of being the homestead that people pointed to when they wanted to make an argument about what was possible, which was a pressure that neither Wesley nor Bula had asked for, and which sometimes chafed. There were neighbors who came around and neighbors who didn't. There were clankin of Bulas who came south in 2s and 3s to see for themselves, and most of them left with the look of people who have had a theory revised by evidence. And one of them, a young woman named Sarah, who was a distant cousin, and who had been watching the free exit clause situation closely, came and stayed, and worked a neighboring plot, and eventually became part of the loose community that had grown up around the Kettlemore Market Road. Roan grew up with his mother's physicality and his father's quietness, and a range of abilities that were their own combination of both. He was the child who could track a deer through brush by the age of 7, and who was also, by the age of 8, keeping meticulous records of the kitchen garden yield in a little notebook that Aldrich sent from the city. He had his mother's tusks, smaller and smoother at his age, and his father's brown eyes, and a complete absence of self-consciousness about what he was, which Wesley thought was probably the greatest gift either of them had managed to give him, the gift of the homestead itself, a place where what he was had never once been treated as a problem. Wesley Easton was 38 when the second child came, a girl this time, born in summer with her mother's amber eyes and a disposition that was, from the very first days, significantly more outgoing than anyone else in the family. They named her Essa, which was Bula's mother's sister's name, and which Bula said when she told him the name she wanted with a small, careful formality that meant she was offering something precious and slightly vulnerable. And he said yes immediately, and she looked at him with the warm, direct, entirely unguarded gratitude that she still occasionally showed him, still sometimes surprised by his willingness to receive her completely. And he thought he would spend his whole life making sure she always had reason to show him that look. The agricultural pamphlet had by this point spawned a correspondence that had become something larger, a set of frontier land management documents that were being used in settlement schools as far east as the major cities, and which carried both their names on the cover, Bula Easton and Wesley Easton. She had taken the name by her own choice, not by any requirement. She told him that she was choosing it the way she had chosen everything since she left the clan, deliberately and for her own reasons, and it was hers now, as the homestead was hers, as he was hers. There was a day, perhaps 10 years after the first dawn when she had collapsed against the fence post, when Wesley was in the south field and the field was entirely cultivated now, every acre of it green and productive and sound, and he looked up from the work and saw the whole of what they had built. The cabin extended twice now, solid and warm. The barn larger with 2 horses and a proper milk cow. The smokehouse. The kitchen garden in full summer riot. The fence line, the sound, strong fence line that he and Bula had repaired together on the 3rd day, and which had been maintained and extended, and was now the boundary of something real. Roan was at the far end of the field. Essa was somewhere in the direction of the barn, because he could hear her talking, which she did always and to anyone available including the horses. And Bula was coming toward him across the field, her dark hair still in its braid though there was silver in it now at the temples, the copper rings replaced with iron ones that Essa had chosen, and she was carrying 2 cups of something hot, and her amber eyes caught the summer light, and she was as beautiful and as grounding and as completely herself as she had been the first time he had really looked at her. She reached him and handed him the cup and looked out at the field beside him, following his gaze. "Still winning the argument," she said. "The field," he looked at the green acres. "I think it surrendered quite a while ago." "It took both of us," she said. "It would not have surrendered to just one." "No," he agreed. "Nothing worth having ever does." She leaned against him there in the field the way she had leaned against him in the barn the day he had told her about Aldrich's letter, easy and sure of her welcome. He put his arm around her. The summer air was warm and full of the smell of growing things, and the fence line was straight and strong, and the children were somewhere near, and the world was exactly as wide and exactly as possible as it needed to be. He thought about the October dawn when he had walked out onto his porch with unlaced boots and seen her there, fallen against the fence post like something the night had tried to hold onto and finally had to let go. He thought about the bread he had left without a word, because words were too much and too little at once, and the only honest thing had been to leave something and step back and let her choose. She had always had to choose. She had chosen everything that mattered, to run, to rest, to take the bread, to stay, to trust him, to say yes at the fence line and yes at the fire and yes in the south field on a May morning when he had asked her to be his. Every yes freely given, every one of them the most important thing he had ever received. He pressed his lips to her temple. She tilted her face up and looked at him with those amber eyes, reading him the way she always could, the way she had read him from the beginning. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "The first morning," he said. "The bread," she said. "The bread," he confirmed. She smiled, that full, warm, real smile that she gave freely now, the one she had been so careful with in the beginning, and she said, "That was either the strangest or the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me." "I am going to say it was both," he said. "Yes," she said. "It was both." She took his hand and they stood together in the field that had taken both of them to tame, on the land that had both their names on it, and the summer went on around them, and Roan called from the far end of the field for some help with something, and Essa's voice from the barn rose in response to some perceived injustice of the livestock world, and Wesley and Bula looked at each other and both of them laughed, the easy, full laugh of people who know exactly what their life is and have decided with the whole of themselves that it is good. She walked toward the barn. He walked toward Roan. And the homestead hummed with the particular warmth of a life that had been built piece by piece, day by honest day, from one silent act of bread left on a fence rail in the cold gray dawn, into something so complete and so full of love that neither of them would have changed a single turn of the path that had brought them to it. The fence post still stood. He had never replaced it, the original one, sunk deep by the two of them in the third week she was there, wrapped now with a weathered iron ring that Essa had added 2 summers ago because she thought it looked distinguished. It stood at the corner of the south field where the lane met the yard, solid as ever, witness to everything. On the rail above it, out of habit and out of love, and out of the particular honesty of a man who had learned early that the truest things are often done without words, Wesley sometimes still left bread. Not for any reason, just because it was where everything had started, and some things are worth remembering in the language they began in.